You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Well, hey, everybody, this is Doug Thorpe, and you're listening to another episode of Leadership Powered by Common Sense. Today, I've got a gentleman who is actually a partner with another guest I had recently, but his name is John Makarewicz. He's with Ferris Capital Partners. John, welcome to the show.
Doug, so glad to be here. Happy to, connect again and looking forward to the conversation.
I broke one of my cardinal rules. I wanted to square up your name before I got online here, and I hope I didn't butcher it too badly.
Actually, you nailed it. It's funny. Normally, like the average is about 3 attempts, and then the person finally gets it right. But it is an unusual name, but you nailed it. So all good.
Well, good. Well, as is a little bit of a custom here on the show, give us a backstory on your journey in the business world or in life, if you will, and just tell us how you got into what you're doing now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I actually was down at Florida State at college, and I was somebody who sort of coasted through high school, partly because, I can test well, I could talk well. So sometimes through, just a little charm and, maybe a little manipulation with the teacher, I could get a pass on an assignment. And what I found when I got to college is, oh gosh, like I really don't have developed study skills. And so, it was one of these things that, they say education is wasted on youth. And I do somewhat believe that, because almost like if I could go back to college today, I think it'd be like the coolest thing ever. And like, who knows, maybe one day I will. But all that said, I spent a few years there, came back home because, I was in a fortunate situation where my parents were able to pay. And actually, I woke up one morning with just this tremendous amount of guilt that, I'm here I am, my parents are supporting me and I'm not doing what I need to do. So I realized it was the environment. I came back home and was taking some courses, but, a couple friends of mine that were a few years older got into real estate and they were really enjoying it. They got a real estate degree, but somehow ended up in residential. Typically that path is into commercial. So I said, you know what, I'm going to do this for a little while until I figure out what I really want to do. But I realized how much I love sales. I love meeting people, talking to people, and helping people navigate, which is, kind of considered one of the top 5 stressors in the world, like moving, right? It's like marriage, divorce, health issues, and like moving are some of those top 5 stressors. And so, I ended up really enjoying it. And then, of course, I look back and it's a few years later and I'm still in the business and things are going great. And then the Great Recession happened. So kind of to cut a long story short, I left the company I was with and teamed up with a guy named Mark Spain. We hit it off immediately and he was very ambitious. And so he had this vision sort of for like a real estate team, which is typically where the team leader or the company does the marketing, brings in the leads, and then provides those leads to the agent. So there's a little more top end control. So things like who we're hiring, who we're bringing on, where the traditional brokerage is really a numbers game. How many agents can we bring in? And so not to disparage that, it's just a different business model. But Mark had this vision. He's like, I think we can like scale this up. I think we can go to multiple cities and I think we could eventually build something to sell. And that was a 15-year journey, but we got there. And so over time, as I kind of built trust with him, he layered on additional responsibilities. I started as a salesperson, but eventually was managing the buyer team, then eventually overseeing all sales, and then eventually director of operations, and then finally president and CEO. He brought me in as a partner when we built out our own brokerage, so I had equity in the business. And it was just a lot of fun, man. We ended with 600. The day I left, there were 650 people there. And wow. It was just so cool to me. Like when I think back, when we would get like the biggest team in the USA by transaction volume or the top team in Atlanta or all those great accolades, it was exciting. But when we would win like best place to work by the Atlanta Business Chronicle, that was like what really kind of got my juices flowing. And so thinking about 650 people that I'm sort of directly and indirectly like helping those people, like that's like their income, like helping them support their families. It's just something that I'm really passionate about. So we did have a private equity exit in 2021, which was fantastic. And, I hung around for 2 years, per the request. And my plan was to stay there forever, but it just sort of changed, right? It became a little bit more organizational. We weren't necessarily innovating. It was more about doing more of the same. And so I realized I was unhappy. And so we, made the decision mutually for time for me to move on. And that's when I connected with Mark Ferris. Now, I had known him for about 5 years prior to this because we had very similar businesses. He also has a residential real estate team in Canada, and we would mastermind. So when I shared with him I had left, he pitched this Ferris Capital Partners idea to me. And what I loved about it is it was real estate. but a whole different category of real estate, commercial, more on the ownership side versus the sales side, brokerage side. So an opportunity to leverage some of the skills that I had learned, but more importantly, to build something again. I love that building process. Like I thrive in stress and pressure and, figuring out problems and challenges. I used to tell my team at Mark Spain Real Estate, like, when you suffer with a problem for 2 or 3 weeks and then bring it to me, it's like you hurt my feelings because you actually deprive me of the thing I like to do, which is talk through problems and hopefully help create a solution. It's not like I always have the best idea, but just that process of talking through and, writing down pros and cons lists and doing green light meetings and red light meetings was super exciting for me. So being back into that startup phase is something that's really exciting for me. And we've had a lot of early success. And so really, really passionate about what I'm doing today.
Love it. Love it. Well, and, congratulations on that startup, grow up and exit game, that puts you in rarefied air. Not everybody gets to end that story that way, but that's awesome. And you're right. I mean, the big crash of '08 was a huge thing. I had a mortgage finance related business in '08 that was in its 5-year mark and, tracking along pretty well. And then when the crash happened, all the air went out of the balloon. I mean, it was just over. And I had to call my short list of investors and tell them I wasn't going to write any more checks, and I didn't expect them to. And they all agreed. And we had a nice orderly winding down. So, we didn't get to close the story the way I really had hoped we could. But it's life lessons and things you learn along the way. But I'm curious about something in your story, John. So you went to work with this partner in building that business. And as you said, you were kind of principally on the sales side originally, but you progressed through the business and obviously to become, president and CEO of it. There was some leadership being exhibited somewhere along the way that at least your partner, your founder partner there recognized. Where do you think that came from?
Yeah. So, I was fortunate. My father grew up in poverty. His father was an alcoholic. His mom died young. He was raised by aunts and uncles, but often moving, every year to a different aunt and uncle. But he was the type that just, there was something in him that just said, I want something different. And so, without boring you with the whole story, he saw the writing on the wall with the Vietnam War and knew kind of where he sat in the, kind of grand scheme of things and wasn't going to be getting a deferral. Right. So he actually volunteered, went into the Navy, was deployed to Vietnam, came back and, decided, my mom and dad originally from Pennsylvania, they were high school sweethearts. He said, why don't we move down to Florida where it's a little bit warmer, big Beach Boys fan. Right. And so went down there to learn to surf, but got his degree at the University of Central Florida and was recruited into Trust Company, which then became SunTrust, which then became Truist. Right. But through that, got an opportunity at a job for an aluminum manufacturing concern in Atlanta. And he ended up at the end of his career, the CEO of Ryerson. They were acquired by this larger company. They're like a Fortune 500 company. And so it was interesting. I got to watch that career trajectory sort of occur in real time, kind of going from like, I would say sort of like middle class to, the CEO kind of position. And what I saw was that he was always willing to say yes. So for example, when the company said, hey, we need you to go to Charlotte, operations aren't going great there. It's a 2-year assignment. So like uprooting your family, knowing it's just for 2 years, came back to Atlanta. And then it was like, hey, we need you in Chicago. And he just always would be willing to say yes. Now, of course, it was a family decision, but my mom was very supportive of his career. And so that's one lesson I learned, that like, say yes to the tough assignment, right? Don't shy away from those. The book, The CEO Next Door, I wish I could remember the author's name off the top of my head, but gives so many examples of that, of it's taking on that assignment nobody else wants and being willing to do whatever it takes, right, to succeed. And so seeing that journey was part of it. He was very conservative financially, I think partly because he grew up in poverty. So I watched that he was very thoughtful with his money. We weren't always in the biggest, nicest house. He drove, a Buick company car. He could have got a Mercedes if he wanted, but he's like, look, we're in manufacturing. I'm going on these plants and touring around. If I'm walking around in a Rolex and in an Audi, Like, how can I expect these guys to, maybe not unionize or take a pay cut or whatever he was working on that may had to happen due to economic circumstances. So, that ability for him to build relationships through all levels of the business, as the CEO or president, whatever title he was in, like he had great relationships with everybody up and down, the company. And so a lot of those lessons were learned through him. I mean, one of my favorites is the 24-hour rule. If you're in an emotional state, don't respond for 24 hours, right? So I think I just had a really good mentor there. And a lot of it was just observation. It's not like we were sitting down and he was like, here's how you grow your career. It's just I monitored and I watched, right? So that was part of it. And then Mark Spain, who I mentioned, he was 10 years older than me. So it was almost like a big brother, little brother relationship versus a paternal thing. But he would just teach me lessons that he had learned along the way in his career. And I think part of it, I would say that leadership can be learned, to be very clear. But, in high school, I was always the person who was selected to lead the group project, and there was just there was just something I observed in myself where people would listen to me and ask for my opinion on things. So those are some of the key lessons, but that willingness to always say yes to those tough assignments, always that relentless, like never give up attitude. But my behavioral style is one in which I am very results oriented, right? So that's, I push to get results. And so I think that's what Mark observed. But what was really cool is he invested in me. So I worked with like 3 different executive coaches over 10 years that, the first one was all about process or hiring process, our onboarding for new employee process, and our ongoing training and development process. Then I worked with somebody who was more about me internally. Empathy is not a strong suit of mine initially about 10, 15 years ago because I was so results oriented. So he taught me how to really slow down. He called it the emotional handshake and really develop. And then, candidly, a way I've developed empathy, and people somewhat are surprised by this, but I read a lot of really great literature and fiction, and reading stories about people from different lifestyles and backgrounds and, different life experiences has really helped me taught that humans are largely the same, but, through luck, some of us happen to be born in the United States. Some of us happen to be born in Guatemala. And that means a very different life, right? And so being able to put myself a little bit more in the shoes of these other people. And so through that coach, I developed empathy and a lot of just, once again, working on myself. And then my third coach kind of went back to the more tactical kind of thing. But books are my mentors. I always seek out mentors or, even engage, paying a coach, right? So that's something I've learned, that nobody has all the answers. And the more people that you can pull from, the more you can learn from other people, the better you'll become.
Yeah, great story. And when your partner, Mark Ferris, and I met, and we talked a lot about the mentorship thing. I had shared with him that I grew up the only child of a single mom. And the one big thing she did for me, among many, was because my dad was not on the scene. I mean, he had passed away. It wasn't that he was even available. She surrounded me with mentors at an early age, and I just got used to the dynamic of finding a mentor. If there was an issue or a theme that I didn't know or didn't understand, there was a mentor that could help me navigate through that. And it wasn't always looking at big picture stuff, large, generic. Sometimes it was very specific. And she hooked me up with one guy that was a neighbor that had this wood shop, and at like 12 years old, he started teaching me how to be a woodworker, and just as a hobby that I've carried with me, for a long time. And it's a creative outlet, and a lot of good stuff to know.
Yeah.
But the value of having that external influence and it sounds like your dad obviously did a great job imparting some experiences and, being able to pay attention to that. But the other thing I picked up in what you were describing in your story, and I want to talk about this a little bit, in the whole realm of leadership and management theory, there's this raging debate: are leaders born or bred? Is it nature or nurture? And what I've come to say is, thankfully, it's both. And doing what I do with trying to help people in their leadership journeys, There are inevitably those that have sort of a natural, innate ability to lead. And you talk about kind of in your early school days always being the guy that, got picked to lead a team or lead a project. That's because inevitably you probably were demonstrating some of that, and the older, wiser ones around you knew it and knew that was a good choice. And it was probably in somebody's heart and mind, it was your opportunity to flourish with what seemed to be an innate skill. But for others, you get thrust into a leadership role, you get hired at a company, you do great work, let's say in sales, you're the number one sales guy. So what does the company do? They say, we want to make you the sales leader,
That's right.
the sales manager. And that doesn't always work out real well.
Often it doesn't, unfortunately. I've learned that lesson the hard way myself a few times, to be very sure. Yes.
Yeah. So, it is interesting. So let me all that said, as you think about your rise in that other organization, and when you started picking leaders, can you think about, what was it you looked for when you wanted to promote somebody into a management role?
Yeah. So first of all is authenticity, right? So, that's sort of a tough thing to maybe put your finger on, but is this person being true to who they are? So I like to see consistent behavior across their life. So, we do leverage some behavioral assessments at both of my companies as part of the hiring process. And the one we use will actually show this is who they think they should be at work versus this is who they are. And then this is like what that looks like. And so I look for consistency across those things. So that person's the same at home as they are in the workplace. Because authenticity to me is so critical, because if I'm sitting down to give some feedback to, maybe one of my direct reports, but they can sense that I've never actually walked that walk, or, it's not coming from a real place of heart or care for them, they're not going to listen, right? So being authentic and true to who you are. And so to that point with leaders, it's like, yes, there are maybe some that maybe have that gift of gab, that charm, that results orientation that kind of maybe makes them a more natural leader. But I've seen many introverts, many perfectionistic type personalities, more process oriented people become incredible leaders because they learn. And I said it earlier, right? But that empathy, that ability to connect with other people, see things from their lens and their perspective, and then make that connection through authentic relationship. I think that is so critical to success. I'm a big believer in servant leadership. In other words, there's not one thing in the company I'm not willing to personally do myself. So when we're in a capital raise, there's been times where we have more leads than our inside sales team can get to. And we are firm believers in speed to lead. So guess what? Start sending me leads. I'll make some calls. When we're on property, if I walk past a cigarette butt, I pick it up and throw it in the trash can, And so that demonstration that it's not just me down, up on the mountain barking down orders, like I'm right alongside you. And, that ability to see around corners a little bit and kind of anticipate what could coming next. So, really understanding all aspects of the business. So that's something that I would look for. So for example, if we had maybe an administrator that was showing some, leadership capabilities, I would pull them into the office, spend time with them, get to know them better, and then challenge them with a couple assignments that were maybe a little bit outside of their job description. But going back to, are they willing to take that step or add more value before they ask for value? And then develop it that way. And then I would monitor to see, like, who are the magnets within the company, right? Is there an agent that just people naturally gravitate towards to ask questions, that they know they can go to, and that, sort of a de facto mentor without the title, right? That leader without a title type person. So a lot of it's just observation. And so I'm a big believer in lead by walking around, right? Just, we were literally in the office at Mark Spain Real Estate, and I would tour all of our locations on a quarterly basis. And I would just spend the day just walking around, chatting, talking with people, getting to know them, learning about them. And so that's where you can start to observe, who are those leaders without a title? Who's the person who's sort of taking, in a sense, a good control of the office and planning the social events and, trying to bring the team together more closely. And then when we identified those people, I would start a mentorship program. So I had like a leadership academy. We would meet monthly, and then quarterly on a more robust meeting, I would impart leadership lessons I've learned. We'd have little homework assignments. put them in partnership groups to work on things. And so we would do some internal development, but it all starts with observation. You have to know your team, right? You have to identify. Now, if we're hiring from the outside, what I looked for was a track record of success in what we're looking for, so, if it's a sales leader, 5 to 7 years of sales leadership experience with a proven track record. I look for optimism and pragmatism. So, if somebody's coming in, oh, well, this last company, the boss was this and that, and they're negative and all this stuff. It's like, that's an instant red flag for me. There's a way you can talk about a bad situation without pointing fingers and taking blame. I'm a big believer in extreme ownership. And at the end of the day, if it just didn't work out, that's fine. But if they're negative about it, then that's a red flag. So it's a very thoughtful process. And when we hire a leader, it's a 4-step interview process, Doug. I mean, we don't just make a fast decision. I purposely slow play it. And it's interesting. Occasionally people get frustrated and tap out. And I'm like, well, gosh, if they're tapping out of this, what's going to happen when a new competitor comes into the marketplace and eats 20% of our market share overnight, and we have to react to it very quickly? They're going to crack under the pressure because they couldn't handle the pressure of a 2-week interview process, right?
Yeah.
So, I hate to say testing, but you look for those little things, right? And those little clues along the way. And then, once that person's on, right? And this goes down to if it's just an employee, an administrator or whatever, making sure you have a very good onboarding plan. You're spending a lot of time with them, asking them a lot of questions, getting to know them on a regular basis, and ensuring they have all the tools and resources they need to be successful. I will say, generally, we look for people that have that leadership behavior style, that results orientation, but there's shades of that. So it's not like, oh, your behavioral assessment didn't turn out the way we thought, we're not offering you the job. That's not it at all. But okay, if this person's going to work out, I know I need to support them by giving them, say, for example, their behavioral assessment shows that they're a little slower to accept change. Well, if I know change is coming, picking up the phone saying, hey, I had this idea, I wanted to run past you, get your thoughts on it, ease them into it a little bit. So then when the change rollout comes, it's not like they're caught flat-footed and now are reactive or defensive about it. So I always say the role of any leader, whether it's me as a leader managing another leader within the company or just an employee, we both have to take a step in each other's direction. So like, I know what you need to be the most successful person. I know the information you need, the communication style you need. So I'm going to come in your direction, but you also need to come in mine too. And so that's what I look for too, that ability to self-awareness, right? That like, I know sometimes I'm impatient. I know sometimes I move too fast. So I'm going to slow things down a little bit. But if you move too slow and don't like change, I'm going to ask you to trust and accept some change, but I'm going to try to give you all the data on why we're making this change, right? So that direction where we're both moving towards each other is something I look for. So generally when a leader doesn't work out, in my world, it's because they're unwilling to change at all, right? They're unwilling to take that step towards our direction.
Yeah. I love that visual, and it goes back to something I learned from a great boss I worked for in my early banking days, and he had this hallmark phrase when we were problem solving or settling an argument. He said the truth is in the middle.
Yeah.
No one is 100% right and no one is 100% wrong. The truth's in the middle. So I kind of extrapolated that, and I've started talking about, building a bridge between two islands. You've got your own existence on your island. They've got their existence on their island, whatever that may be. And the best thing you can hope for is a good, strong bridge between the two, and walk out on the bridge and meet in the middle and see what you can get done.
That's right.
And I've only had one experience in my whole management life of having a person in an organization that I was trying to assist, and we just had probably the textbook version of a personality conflict from day one. And we'd actually been working together over a year, but it was a hard year, for both of us. And I was always trying to get to the middle of the bridge. And I finally one day asked this person, I said, let's do a visual here. And I gave her the island and bridge thing. I said, can we just meet in the middle of the bridge? I'm not telling you I'm 100% right, but we need to meet in the middle of the bridge. And she said, absolutely not.
Yeah,
Oh,
there you go.
okay. Well,
Well, where do we go from here, right?
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And so, the point being, most of the time people are willing, they get that and they do understand. And you're right. Like you said, occasionally you've got a person that's just unwilling to
Yeah.
change. And that's probably exactly the point of this, the person in my story, big struggle to change and do anything different compared to what they thought was the right answer at the get-go there. The other thing I'm thinking about, I love that idea. You said, as you bring leaders on, you did your own kind of internal leadership academy thing. I think that's brilliant and something I have seen companies adopt and embrace. And really giving that opportunity, because all too often, back to what we were joking about, the rock star sales guy getting promoted to sales lead, they're put in that role with no safety net, no assistance whatsoever. It's like, we're going to make you the sales team manager. And they're looking around going, what is that?
Yeah, that's right.
What do I need to do with that? And interestingly, and depending on the size of the business, that person can muddle through that first promotion and do okay, and the sales team continues to thrive. So now they say, well, we're going to elevate you one more time, and they bump that up maybe 2 or 3 iterations, and still with no support, no coaching, no training, no other, specific assistance. And then they kind of plateau. They just really don't get what it takes to operate at those higher levels.
Yeah, I think I can't remember who said it, but this idea that a lot of people get promoted to their level of incompetence, right? I say that, but I don't always love that, because is it on them, or is it on the company for not teaching them the competence, right? But I think it's interesting, because I think as humans we tend to think in black and white. It's like a tribal thing, right? Going back to the thousands and thousands of years ago, fight or flight, and we try to simplify things into the path of least resistance, right? In our mind, how we think everything is about that. And the reality is everything's nuance and, color, right? So, I mean, not to go too far down this path, but I read this like really fascinating book about the Somali pirate phenomenon. And it's like, you might think, oh, it's just a bunch of evil people trying to steal or whatever. And I'm not excusing the behavior, but the reality is the Japanese and the Chinese overfished their waters, collapsed the fishing supply. Other countries dumped toxic waste offshore, and their whole mode of making money was fishing. And so the world, meaning to or not, created a situation where there was no way for these people to make money. So they turn to this. Now, once again, it's not excusing the behavior, but it's just understanding the empathy behind why somebody might have to be making that decision, because it's a choice of starving and dying or putting some food on their table. So once again, it's an odd example, but it just shows you that not everything's just what it seems. You have to dig a few layers deeper. We talk about the immigration issue in the United States. Did the United States do things in Central and Latin America that may have created an environment where economic opportunity no longer exists, which is meaning more people want to come? Yes. Does it mean we should allow everybody in without vetting? No, but there's nuance here. And I think so often we think about things in black and white, right and wrong, when often there are so many shades. So with human behavior, it's no different, right? And so that's right. When I see some behavior that seems counterintuitive or not like normal for that person, it's like picking up the phone immediately and say, hey, I just noticed on the huddle, is everything okay? You feeling okay? Like, not like an accusation, but like sometimes they're just under the weather, right? Maybe they only got 5 hours of sleep because they got a newborn at home and they're just, they were a little on edge. But by doing that, it's like showing that I trust them and that, they can open up to me. And I found so often when performance dips, it's like maybe they're going through a divorce, maybe their child is sick, maybe there's alcohol issues, different things. And some of those things we can help with and fix. I'm not in the psychiatrist business, but can I help them navigate that problem and help them fix what may be causing that work performance issue? And so that's that empathy component I talk about. And that's that servant leadership component I talk about. We're all humans and we all have problems. And to a certain extent, I do believe you sometimes have to leave those problems at the front doormat when you walk into the office, right? But inevitably, sometimes it spills over. And so I have a very, I would say almost on the level personal relationship with every single person who works for me. I know their kids' names. I know what they've got going on. I know what their hobbies are. And it's because I'm genuinely interested, right? And I think going back to fiction, like that understanding that so many people have had like everybody's on their own hero's journey, right? And so learning what that journey is and what's led to how they become how they are makes me more curious. And then when we're having those feedback conversations, I can point to things like, hey, I noticed in this part of your career, things are really going well. Can you look back in that, maybe figure out what was happening in that time and why you were finding that success? And you're like, you know what? I actually had a lot of assistance from this person, or, we had just done a seminar 2 days prior. Like I'll use myself as an example. I love going to Mark and I just went to a 2-day marketing seminar in Las Vegas. And it's like, I'm so fired up. I mean, we reconfigured things, we're making changes. So it's like, I know about myself that every few months I got to kind of go to something like that, to get that energy and get around new people and new ideas. And so knowing that, I do that, right? But everybody has those things. So helping to find what are those things that juice them up, fire them up, get them excited to show up every day, and trying to create an environment where we can't always do everything for everybody, but at least create a pathway for them to find those things that give them that fire in their belly and get them going. Right. So it's all about people, right? I think at the end of the day, the best leaders are the ones that really understand human behavior and understand people and have a way of building and bridging, to use your example, those relationships.
Yeah. I love this theme you're talking about, the relationship building. And the first time you said it, I quickly flashed to, I've done a lot of work with pretty senior executives in some pretty big businesses. And as they start seeing the light of the exit door, retirement or whatever it may be, they start reflecting, and inevitably, I think 100 out of 100, what they tell me is the one regret I have is I didn't do enough relationship building.
Wow.
I was very focused on the next goal, the next milestone, the next project, the next acquisition, whatever. And I just feel like I didn't do enough relationship building. And they had this realization, and of course, oftentimes when you do a 360, the feedback you get is that no, they're pretty good relationship builders, but there's this fire of wishing you could do more. And for the sort of midlife and older leaders, I often, when we start coaching, I start asking them, well, have you thought about your legacy? What does that look like? And you've still got runway to change that if you don't like what you believe the legacy story might be. What do you want to do now to change that and restyle it? And for those who are lamenting the relationship thing, guess what? They almost go, full speed into the relationship, either repair or building.
Yeah.
To really engage that way.
It's so interesting you bring that up. So going back to my father, so he did pass away about 10 years ago, and we did more of the celebration of life in the true sense. Like we had friends and, aunts and uncles tell funny stories and just, kind of like, their experience with my dad. And I gave the final eulogy, and all that to say, I couldn't sit down for the next 2.5 hours. There were hundreds of people at this event. And what caught my attention was I had multiple people who came to me who said, your dad actually laid me off. And so what happened is Ryerson acquired the company JM Toll, and it was private equity buyout, right? And so they're like, we need to, create some efficiencies, layoffs, right? And so guys that my dad had hired 20 plus years ago, mentored, built a relationship with, the kind of relationship where there's, dinner parties and, and then of course he elevates to CEO or president, and he has to kind of take a little bit of a step back from that. But these are like friends, right? And the stories I heard was, when, I had literally just moved to Colorado at the company's request. And then 6 months later, I find out I'm being laid off. And it's like, your dad actually helped me find that next job. Like he got on the phone, called competitors and said, you really need to talk to this guy. He's super talented. And there were so many examples and stories just like that of just little things he did that he didn't have to do. And, candidly, part of the reason he died young, I think, is that experience. It led him, and I don't mind sharing, it led him to drinking. I don't think people talk enough about the fact that 10% of Americans drink 50% of the alcohol. We have a lot of issues with substance abuse in our country. And so I actually even talked about that in the eulogy. And what was interesting is how many people came up and just shared their stories. And so that ability going back to being authentic and just doing the right thing in the relationships. And I think they say, right, a good sign is, how many people show up at your funeral, right? And there were hundreds of people there. I didn't even get to eat. It was a good thing, but I was just inundated with people who wanted to come and talk to me and tell me about some positive experience my father had made on their life. And so that taught me a lot. It was at a great age because it was 10 years ago. I was in leadership, but I was still developing my leadership skills. And I was like, man, that's what I want. I want that. And I will say one thing that makes me very proud is I left Mark Spain Real Estate 3 years ago, and I still occasionally get a text message, a Facebook message, or a LinkedIn message from somebody saying, you changed my life. I was making $60,000. I never thought I'd make more than that in my life. Through your mentorship and leadership at Mark Spain Real Estate, I started making $300,000, bought my first home, and this, that. And it's like, gosh, man, is there anything better in the world than that, that you help somebody? And look, I'm a capitalist, right? It's about making money, but there's a way you can do it where you're not harming people, you're helping people, you're pushing them along. And by the way, to that point, you try to build that bridge. The woman didn't want to cross the bridge. So that might mean you have to part ways, right? That's a reality of business. We're not here to fix people. We're here to help people, and that's how I view it. That's it.
Right. Totally agree. Well, John, this has been great. Tell folks the best way to get a hold of you if they would like to connect and learn more about your work.
Yeah. So Faris Capital Partners, FARIS Capital Partners is our company website. You can book in a time to talk. You can easily find me on LinkedIn or on Instagram. My name's John Makarewicz. I'm sure it'll be in the show notes. So there's not many of us out there, so you'll find me there. I'm trying to get better about posting more content on my social pages, but feel free to reach out with a DM if you're a leader and maybe you're intrigued by something I've said or my hiring process or whatever. Always happy to jump on a call and walk you through a little bit, share whatever lessons I might have learned. I'm still on my journey. I got a lot left to learn, Doug, but I'm always happy to share anything that I have found along the way.
Well, thank you, John. And you're right. We will have all that info in the show notes, as always, folks. So if you do want to check out John's work, just manage one of those links that we're going to have there. But one last time, thank you so much. This has been great. Really appreciate you sitting in.
My pleasure, Doug. It was awesome. Thanks for your time and looking forward to staying in touch.
Absolutely. Well, folks, we're going to wrap this up. If you do need to get a hold of me, you can reach out to my website simply at dougthorpe.com. Got a lot of information about my coaching programs and ideas there and would love to also book a time with you, just free, no obligation, no hard sell. Just learn about your journey, what you're doing, what you might be interested in, and see if I can help. I do like to remind you, we've got a video version of this show over on YouTube, channel by the same name, Leadership Powered by Common Sense. Check that out. Look at the archives. We're over 400 now and continuing on. So we got a lot of content, a lot of great guests and great stories to listen in on. But I think that's about it for today. So we're going to wrap up. Say goodbye. Go out there and make it a great day.
Thanks, Doug.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit dougthorpe.com.